What happens when a man raised around power begins to believe that power itself may be the danger? Not simply corrupt leaders, not merely bad policies, but the tendency of institutions to expand beyond their limits. In the last episode, we explored the world that shaped Robert Taft, a world of law, duty, restraint, and hard work. A world where power was not viewed as something to celebrate, but something to justify, and where the rule of law was understood not as decoration, but as a limit. Robert Taft believed something that now feels almost foreign, that constitutions matter most when they become inconvenient, and that belief would place him in conflict, not just with political opponents, but increasingly with his own side. But upbringing alone does not explain a man. Eventually, those instincts become ideas, and in Taft's case, those ideas developed into a political philosophy that increasingly stood against the direction America itself was moving. Robert Taft is often reduced to a label, conservative, but that word no longer explains very much, because Taft was not anti-government in the simplistic sense. This is important to understand. He supported federal housing programs, backed infrastructure spending in certain cases. And when he became convinced that real suffering or disorder existed, he was willing to depart from party orthodoxy. This surprised many people around him, because Taft was not driven primarily by ideology. He was driven by structure, by limits, by whether a policy remained confined or whether it became the beginning of something larger. And this is why he once said, "Liberty is not made more secure by denying the people the right to think as they please." That line matters, because it reveals something deeper than partisanship. For Taft, freedom was not merely economic, it was constitutional, moral, civilizational. What mattered most to Taft was not whether government acted, but whether limits remained intact, whether institutions still restrained power or merely organized its expansion. Because for Taft, the Constitution was not simply procedural, it was protective, a structure designed not merely to create authority, but to contain it. And he believed this most strongly when the pressure to ignore limits became greatest. During the Nuremberg trials, for example, Taft made one of the most controversial statements of his career, not because he supported the Nazis, he absolutely did not, but because he feared the abandonment of legal principles. He warned against ex post facto punishment, against bending legal standards in moments of moral outrage. And regardless of whether one agrees with him on that issue, it revealed how seriously he took constitutional process, even when doing so was politically dangerous, even when doing so damaged him publicly, because Taft believed that once legal principles became conditional, they stopped being principles. And this ultimately was Taft's concern, not merely this policy or that policy, but the broader tendency of government to exceed the boundaries originally placed upon it. Because once expansion becomes normalized, limits begin to look unreasonable. Temporary measures become permanent structures. Emergency powers become precedents. And over time, what once would have been viewed as extraordinary begins to feel ordinary. This is why Taft worried deeply about the growth of executive power. He believed Congress had gradually surrendered too much authority. At one point, he observed that in modern America, one president had become as powerful as 100 senators. This was not a compliment, it was a warning. This is also why Taft became deeply concerned about war, not only because of its human cost, though that mattered to him, but because of what war does to institutions. War centralizes. War accelerates executive power. War expands bureaucracy. And perhaps most importantly, war changes what people are willing to accept. Because fear alters political psychology. It makes expansion easier to justify and restraint harder to defend. Taft feared that permanent military mobilization would eventually reshape the republic itself, that the country would normalize levels of spending, surveillance, and centralized administration that earlier generations would have considered dangerous, and in many ways that concern now feels remarkably modern. And perhaps this is one reason I've been drawn to Taft in the first place, because in an age of near-permanent foreign conflict, and a political culture where even many Republicans increasingly speak the language of intervention, military expansion, and global management, Taft feels like a reminder that this was not always the dominant tendency, that there once existed a serious strain of American political thought deeply concerned with restraint, with constitutional limits, with the long-term consequences of centralized power. And whether one ultimately agrees with Taft or not, I think there is something healthy about studying a figure like him, because he forces us to ask questions that modern politics often prefers to avoid. Not simply, what can government do, but what should restrain it? And yet, Taft was not perfectly consistent. The rise of communism affected him deeply, as it affected many people of his generation, and at times he softened some of his earlier non-interventionalist instincts. This is important not to ignore, because it reveals something deeply human. Even people committed to restraint can be pulled towards expansion when confronted with genuine fear. And perhaps this is one of the hardest political questions of all. How does one preserve limits when danger feels real? Because it is easy to defend restraint in comfort, much harder in crisis. What made Taft unusual was not perfection. It was seriousness. He did not seem intoxicated by power. He did not speak as though government could solve everything. Nor did he particularly seem interested in political theater. In fact, this may have been one reason he struggled politically at times. Taft understood institutions and policy better than he understood performance. And modern politics increasingly rewards performance, not restraint, emotion, not caution, certainty, not limitation. There are moments in the biography where this becomes almost painfully obvious. Dinner parties where he alienated influential people unnecessarily. Campaign stops where he seemed uncomfortable performing warmth. Moments where principle and political instinct simply failed to align. And yet strangely, those same qualities are part of what makes him feel genuine. He often seemed less interested in winning admiration than in saying what he actually believed. What made Robert Taft unusual was not simply that he believed in limits. Many politicians claim that. It was that he tried to hold on to those limits, even when fear made abandoning them feel reasonable, even when expansion was politically rewarded, even when the public mood demanded certainty, strength, and action. Because Taft understood something that history repeatedly demonstrates, that power rarely arrives announcing itself as dangerous. It arrives as necessity, as emergency, as protection. And once societies grow accustomed to expansion, they begin to forget what limits were meant to protect in the first place. That is why Taft matters, not because he was perfect, not because he was always right, but because he wrestled seriously with a question modern politicians often avoid: how do free societies preserve restraint when fear makes restraint feel irresponsible? And perhaps that is why figures like Taft feel so rare now, because in democratic politics, the man warning about the long-term dangers of power will almost always struggle against the man promising immediate security. In the next episode, we move from philosophy to conflict, because Taft's ideas would not remain abstract. They would bring him into direct confrontation with war, with the presidency, and eventually with the future direction of the Republican Party itself. I'll see you in the next episode.